to be back together to study another lesson in the series that we're calling The Trials of Jesus, and focusing to some extent on sort of the legal aspects of what took place from the time of Jesus' arrest to the time where they led him away for his crucifixion. And just as a quick review as to where we were last time we got together at the end of last month, we were talking about the beginning portion of Jesus' Jewish trial, and specifically the court before which he appeared, an institution known as the Sanhedrin. So talked a bit about its origins, where it came from, and how the word Sanhedrin was not a reference to a single body, but was kind of more of a reference to the larger group of courts or organization, for lack of a better term, that was used for adjudication of civil and criminal cases under Jewish law at the time. And it had its origins, as we looked last month, back in the Old Testament under the Mosaic era, when Moses, everyone came to him for them to try to solve their problems. And his father-in-law visited and said, look, this isn't good, you're going to burn yourself out, so you need to set up courts. And so you'll have local courts with 3 judges in each little village, and then you can have one big court kind of in the center of all of Jewish culture that will handle the big cases. And that would be what came to be known as the Grand Sanhedrin. And how many judges, let me test your remembrance, how many judges were there in the Grand Sanhedrin? In other words, how many judges were supposed to be a part of this panel that was going to hear Jesus' case? 71. Because back in that time of Moses, there were 70 elders that he met with, and the 70 elders plus Moses made the 71 judges. This morning, we want to look at Jesus' trials, and that first trial in particular, more from the standpoint of the timing of it all, when it took place, and the duration of his trials, and sort of looking at it from that perspective. With that in mind, turn over to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, we're going to sort of look at and try to understand and really try to get the sequence of events straight in our head. I have to do this every time I go back and teach this class, so I understand how the sequence of events take place as we read about them in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I guess I'll start with just sort of this larger question about trials and ask you, well, I think we're all here are old enough to be alive during the most famous trial in American history during our lifetimes, which was O.J. Anybody know or want to guess how long the O.J. Simpson trial lasted? A lot of CNN coverage. Oh, on the radio. Oh, a long time. It was 8.5 months. 134 days of court coverage. If that trial had lasted 2 days, would you trust the result less? The trial that lasted in the real world 9 months actually lasted a day and a half. Would you think that was a little fishy? Would you be less likely to trust the result? Why? If it was super short, yeah, if it were, instead of 9 months, if it was 2 days, would that make you think, I don't know, something might be up here? A little bit too long, yeah. But you bring up exactly the right point. If it is so super short, maybe it starts to raise questions in your mind. Well, hold on. Did they do a thorough enough job? I mean, this man is being accused of killing 2 people. This person is facing, it wasn't the death penalty in that case, but life imprisonment. This person is facing this lifetime punishment for this crime. Can you really determine in an extremely short period of time whether a person is guilty of that kind of offense? And really, does the law even allow you to move that fast to go through these events? Well, that brings us to the time of Jesus' trial, when we start to ask some questions about, well, how long do these events take place, and did everything get done as thoroughly as you would hope? Because I think what we're going to see this morning is that everything about the timing of Jesus' trials was all wrong. And we really were kind of asking, well, does that affect the legitimacy of the outcome? So let's try to get in our minds the course of events and the sequence of events in Jesus' trial. So we start here in Matthew chapter 26, and we see sort of the events that sort of lead to the trial. And so here in Matthew 26, starting at verse 17, we get a recording of what looks, or what we refer to as the Last Supper, or the institution of the Lord's Supper. And so verse 17 says, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations for you to go eat the Passover? So this is sort of the first time in these sequence events that we get a time period, or we get a time marker. This is where we're sort of grounding ourselves to understand the timing. And he gives us to this, to ground ourselves, this notion of it being the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Breads. And then later in the verse, a reference to Passover. So let's start there by asking, well, what are those events? And we'll leave Passover for a second. What is this Feast of the Unleavened Bread? What is that a reference to? So it's one of the feasts of the Old Testament, and these feasts were usually, there were three of them, three big ones at least, and each of them were a reference, a reminder of certain events. And so the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tents, which is another one of these events, one of these feasts, was a reminder that they, when they were in captivity, used to live in tents. So it was a reminder that God had provided for them, and so for a week they would actually go live in tents. Now this one, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, was a reminder of what? So God's provision for them, but why is the bread unleavened here? What is that? It's a reference to some historic event, not the manna in particular, but what event? Well, let's take the second piece of it, the Passover. So there's a close relationship between the Feast of the Unleavened Bread and the Passover. What is the Passover supposed to be a reminder of? Good. So sort of at the end of that series of plagues in the Exodus, the 10th plague was the killing of the firstborn, which the Israelites were exempt from if they put the blood on the doorpost. And then if they did that, the angel of death would, quote, pass over that home and protect them. And so that's what the Feast of the Passover was. Now, when they did that, were the Israelites welcome any longer in Egypt? No. They had to go. And they were leaving, going on towards the promised land that God was leaving them, and they had to leave in a hurry, right? And so when they made provision for the meal for themselves to go, they put the bread kind of together, mixed up the dough, but they didn't have enough time to allow it to rise because they were on their way out the door, right? And so as a result of that, the bread they had was unleavened bread. It didn't rise. It was flat like a cracker, and that's the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. It's a reminder of God leading them out, passing over them and leading them out. And that's why if you look at some of these Old Testament passages, like for example, if you return to Leviticus chapter 3, read verses 5 and 6, you will see that under their law, God says you have the Passover on day 14 of a particular month, and then afterwards, for the 7 days that follow it, that is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And so it was a reminder of God passing over them to protect them, and then providing for them escape from their captivity in Egypt by that feast for the next 7 days. Okay, so let's keep going from there in Matthew 26. And so Matthew 26, verse 17, we see the reference to the upcoming feast, the upcoming Passover. Then jump down to verse 30. After he institutes the Lord's Supper and he has this meal with them, it says, when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So we sort of ends that occasion, and on that night he goes out to the Mount of Olives. And then we see later down in verse 36 that he's now in the Garden of Gethsemane. So all of these events so far have taken place in the same day, right? That this is right before the feast. He has met with them. He's instituted the Lord's Supper. And now on that same very night, he's with them in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, if you jumped up to verse 31, you will remember while Jesus is dealing with them there in the garden, he tells them, quote, this very night, You will all fall away on account of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. And so what he's telling them there is that, that occasion when Peter denies him 3 times before the cock crows happened that same night. That time where in the garden when Jesus is arrested and all the disciples flee, all that's going to take place within the same few-hour period of when he instituted the Lord's Supper, when they made preparations for the Passover. All this is happening in just a few hours' time. And so it's taking place very, very quickly. Verse 34, Jesus to Peter, I tell you this truth, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. So all this is taking place on that first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And so look over Matthew 26 down at verse 57 when we see Jesus entering his first trial. I say first trial. We did talk a few times class periods ago about his being interviewed or interrogated by Annas, the high priest, or the father-in-law of the high priest. But the first time he's actually before the Sanhedrin or any sort of judicial body is right here. Matthew 26 at verse 57, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. So how much period of time has elapsed here from the time when he is arrested to the time when his trial begins? A few days, several months, hours, if not minutes, right? So this is taking place almost immediately after his arrest. He goes immediately to the trial. And then we see, because remember, what he had told Peter earlier up in verse 34, this very night, you will deny me 3 times. And so we get the entire trial, or the first half of the trial, in verses 57 to 67. And then after that, verse 69, we get Peter doing the denials. And so what that tells us is that same night, Peter denied him. And before those denials, or while those denials are going on, Jesus is already on trial, which means that event took place that very same night, just as Jesus had said would take place about the denials. So what about the rest of Jesus's trials? Well, so turn over to John 18. John 18. It's kind of the next indication of time. John's occasion, and the way John sets up the gospel here, he actually separates Peter's first denial from his second and third denial. But starting at verse 15, John 18, verse 15, we see Jesus is inside on trial in front of the Sanhedrin. Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Now, who's that other disciple? That's John. So it's Peter and John are following. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went in with Jesus. So he's kind of in the room where the Sanhedrin is meeting while Jesus is on trial. Peter is outside, and Peter is obviously, it's nighttime, right? Because they're gathered around the fire. It's cold, it's dark, and then that's when he gives the first denial. And then verse 19, meanwhile. So while Peter is doing the denial, Jesus is inside on trial for these things. And so it's clearly these things are happening very, very quickly, and all happening kind of at the same time at that very night. So from there, turn back to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. And we have to keep going back and forth among these 4 gospels, because we have to put all those pieces together. And since the gospel writers are writing to different audiences, they focus on different pieces, and they give us different clues, especially on the point we're looking at this morning, which is sort of the timing of it all. So after Jesus went on trial in front of the Sanhedrin, when that trial was over, where did he go next? Or when the first part of the Sanhedrin trial was over, where did he go next? So we got a couple options here. We've got Pilate, and at one point in time he goes to at least potentially go on trial in front of King Herod. So who's first? It's Pilate, then Herod, then back to Pilate, because as we continue on, we'll see Herod we didn't want anything to do with it. Pilate was just trying to get rid of it because he thought there might be a jurisdictional issue. But now, when the time that he's actually going to go back in front of the Sanhedrin for a second time, when does that take place? Look at Luke 22 at verse 66. Luke 22 at verse 66. What time does the return to the Sanhedrin, what time of day are we talking about there? Okay, good. So the very beginning of the morning, at daybreak, at the first light, whatever way your translation gives us in Luke 22 at verse 66. So he's gone through one part of the trial, he's gone away to a different part of the trial, and now he's come back in front of the Sanhedrin for sort of this second part of the trial, and it's daybreak. So how much time has passed now from the time that he's been arrested to the time that he's in his second or third portion of the trial? Was it light or dark when he was arrested? Dark, right? They brought torches and lamps to arrest him. So it's after sundown on Thursday night when he's arrested. And then this second or third portion of the trial happens, quote, at daybreak. So we've got a period of, 12 hours there? So a period of about 12 hours, and we've got almost half, if not most, of the entirety of the criminal justice process involving Jesus is already taken place. And so, and then we still have all the events of the Roman trials, him being questioned by Pilate, and him having all those things that take part of that portion of the trial take place. And then, well, what's the next thing that takes place after Jesus is actually convicted, as it were, as someone finds him guilty and sentences him to crucifixion? What happened then? What's the next portion of the sequence of events? Let me ask it this way. Is the place where he was convicted the place where he was crucified? No. So where was he tried? Where in the Roman trial, where did that take place? Yeah, so kind of and then Herod sent him back. Yeah. And so Pilate's the one who ends up issuing the judgment, right? And where would that have taken place? Well, where did Pilate live? Pilate didn't even live in Jerusalem. Pilate lived in a place where, if you break down the term, it makes a lot of sense. He lived in a place called Caesarea. What does that sound like? But take out the EA on the back end of Caesar, right? Yeah, it's because he was a Roman representative, right? So he didn't live in Jerusalem. He lived all the way on the coast up in Caesarea. Now, he had a place where he stayed when he was in Jerusalem, right? It was called a colonnade. It was Pilate's, basically his house or his quarters while he was there. And that's where Jesus' trials took place, kind of in Pilate's courthouse or Pilate's colonnade, as it were. And that's where he was convicted. Now, where did the crucifixions take place? The place called Golgotha, the hill of Calvary, the place called Golgotha, which meant the place of the skull. Now, if you had maps of Jerusalem in the back of your Bible, you will see that is a fair distance apart from one another. So how did the person who was convicted of a crime get from place A to place B? Walked, and what did they take with them? They carried the cross with them, right? So this point in time that we're talking about here, where Jesus is, he has gone for this 12-hour period, right, from sundown or after sundown when he's arrested, to overnight hours when he has been placed on trial, to the early morning we see in Luke 22 verse 66, where a portion of the trial is still going on, till still a few events in the story to take place, after which he still has to, there's the scourging, there's the placing of the crown of thorns on his head, there are all these sorts of things going on, and then after which he has to then carry that heavy cross for, it seems, mile and a half, 2 miles, something like that, from the place where he's convicted to the place where he's ultimately going to be crucified. So at what time does the actual crucifixion scene to begin? We'll turn over to Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15. Mark 15, verse 25. Mark 15, verse 25. What time did the crucifixion itself actually take place? The third hour. Well, what makes you say 9 a.m.? What makes that the third hour? Yeah, how did the Jews count their days? Sunrise to sunset? Or from sunset? Anybody have any Jewish friends? I have some. Yeah, and you're right. Well, now let's think back to how that actually is the case. If you have Jewish friends and they recognize and appreciate the Sabbath, they count it from Friday night to Saturday night, from sundown on Friday night. Now, why do they do that? Why do they count their days from sundown to sundown? If you go back and look at Genesis chapter 1, this is their explanation for it. In Genesis chapter 1, when God created day, this is how he did it. In Genesis chapter 1 at verse 5, it says, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So as Moses records it as it relates to the very creation of time, God sort of counted days in that way, right? There was evening, that's the beginning of the day. There was morning, that's a continuation of the day. And then there was evening again, that's a brand new day. And then that's how they count time. Now, well, how does that make Mark 15:25 make sense? Well, if you count your days from sunfall or from the sunset to sunset, then you've got 12 hours of darkness, right? So you've got hour 1 of darkness, hour 2 of darkness, hour 3 of darkness. And then when the sun rises, you've got 12 hours of day, right? So that is, if you say generally speaking, the sun rising at about 6 a.m., then hour 1 of the day is 6, or it would be 7, excuse me. Then hour 2 of the day would be 8, and hour 3 of the day is about 9. So when we always hear, and you're right, because you'll have a footnote there at verse 25 which says about 9 a.m. And that's basically how it works. So, as it seems, as Mark is describing it, Jesus was hung on the cross at around 9 a.m. So everything between the time of his arrest and the time of him being physically nailed to the cross took place over a period of 15 hours. That seem odd to you? That a person could be arrested for a capital offense and have the sentence for that capital offense be carried out less than a day later? Seems quite unusual. Just to add on to this hours thing, look down in Mark, or turn back to Matthew 27 real quick. Matthew 27, just to make this point, because it's useful for us as Christians. It's useful for us when we recognize the Lord's Supper. It's useful for us in all these things when we're thinking about the events of that day. Matthew 27, look at verse 44. Verse 45, excuse me. Matthew 27 at verse 45. Now, what happens in Matthew 27, verse 45, while Jesus is on the cross? Good. So there was darkness that came over the land for a 3-hour period of time. What 3 hours are we talking about? From the 6th hour to the 9th hour, what would that be? 12 to 3, right? So if 6 a.m. is the beginning of the day, hour 6 is 12, hour 9 is 3. And we're supposed to be impressed by that because, this is not, just the sun came up late that day. This is the middle of the day, and the sun stopped shining for a 3-hour period of time. This is one of the things which makes that Roman centurion look up later and says, okay, clearly this guy was a son of God, because this is weird. There is no natural explanation for what took place here, that the sun would just stop shining for a 3-hour period of time in the middle of the day, at the height of the sun supposed to being in the middle of the sky. So that just tells us that little trick about this measurement of time and how it all took place. And so the points we're trying to make here about the timing is this. I mean, the Jesus's trials, or at least the very first portion of it, they began in the middle of the night, close to midnight, maybe in the early or morning hours of Thursday night into Friday morning. The next thing we see is that the rest of Jesus' trials took place early that morning. What morning was that? What day of the week? Friday morning, right? And Friday is one day before Saturday, which for the Jews was Sabbath, which was an important day. So know that. First portion of Jesus' trial took place in the middle of the night. At least a significant portion of the Jewish trial of Jesus took place the day before the Sabbath. And all of Jesus' trials were completed in less than a single day. And I think what you've already told me this morning is that there are portions of that which makes you think something's off on that. That doesn't seem quite right, that all that happened all that quickly. And I think if you were to look back at Jewish law at the time, you would see that that is absolutely true. So there were 3 provisions of Jewish law related to this sort of thing that I want to mention to you this morning and to think about as it relates to this sort of time period we're talking about. Rule number 1 was this, that for capital offenses, if a person was accused of a crime for which the punishment could be death, for a capital offense, the trial and the verdict had to be delivered in daylight. So the entire trial and the judgment or the ruling on the case had to be issued in judgment. I'll read to you straight from Jewish law on this point. In cases of capital law, the court judges during the daytime and concludes the deliberations and issues the ruling only in the daytime. That was the rule. Now, why would that rule exist? Sorry? Why would it be important? Why would it's so important to them that they say, we're going to put this in law that, okay, this has to take place in the light of day. We're not going to do this in the middle of the night. Okay, good. This needs to be somewhat transparency. There is the Washington Post has a motto now which says, democracy dies in darkness. The concept being there, when you do something in the dark where people can't see what you're doing, it's not fair. Or there's at least reasons to wonder whether it's a legitimate process. And that's part of what is so important to them. They wrote that directly into the law. In fact, it seems like where they got that from is from a passage in Numbers chapter 25, and I'll read it to you. Numbers chapter 25 is the importance of having transparency in how they carried out the law, and especially about when the law was so important or when someone's life is at risk. But this is where they get it from. Numbers 25 verse 4, where it says, the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of these people, kill them, and expose them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. So these were opponents of Israel at that point in time. God orders their death. So there was judgment being executed against them, but God makes very clear to Moses that you're to do this in the daylight, so it can be clear what's going on, so there's no fears about the legitimacy of this process. If you want to see this kind of how the rule really should have been executed, turn over to Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4. After the church begins and the apostles continue to preach and teach even when they're asked not to, they ended up getting arrested. And so in Acts chapter 4, the first couple of verses, Peter and John get arrested for preaching the gospel. And then you see verse 3, it says they seized Peter and John, but they didn't start the trial until the next day. Why? It was at night when they got arrested. They seized Peter and John, and because it was evening, they put them in jail until the next day. They weren't doing them a solid. They weren't doing them a favor by just giving them a place to sleep for the night. They couldn't put them on trial immediately because they had to follow sort of this principle that trials were to take place during the daytime. But they didn't do that when it came to Jesus. And again, we keep asking this question, Why not follow your own rules? What would have changed if they had just put Jesus in jail for a couple days and started the trials at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, as opposed to starting the trials at midnight on Thursday night? What would have changed? They were were they worried that if they didn't try this case in 18 hours, they wouldn't get the result they wanted? I think they were. They definitely seemed that this has to go and this has to go now. If you want to trace this back and you go and you look back in John chapter 11, after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, they convene a meeting in John chapter, I think it's either John 11 or John 12. But the leaders of the Jews convene a meeting, and what made that, it's chapter 11, starting verse 45. But after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, that was the most concerning miracle that Jesus had performed for the Jewish leaders. And there's a couple reasons why. Not just because it was raising someone from the dead. That certainly was part of it. But the other reason was where it took place. Where did the raising of Lazarus take place? Where did Mary, Martha, and Lazarus live? Not Galilee. So that's part of what made it so different. Where do they live? Bethany. Yeah. And how far is Bethany from Jerusalem? Not at all. It's just like right over the hill. In fact, during this last week when Jesus was doing all the things he does before his death, every night he would leave Jerusalem and go spend the night in Bethany. Perhaps, likely, at Mary and Martha's house. We don't know that for sure. But every night he would come in from the city from there. It was very close to the city. Jesus had raised people from the dead before, right? He had raised that little girl from the dead. He had raised the son of the widow in Nain from dead. But both of those took place in Galilee. This raising of the dead took place in Bethany, which is just like right next door to Jerusalem. In fact, a lot of the people who were there when he performed that miracle had come from Jerusalem. And so they meet here in John chapter 11 and says, we got a huge problem because to the extent that those miracles Jesus had performed in Galilee had not made their way back to Jerusalem, this one most certainly was going to. And it wasn't just that that word of Jesus performing this miracle would reach back to Jerusalem. The man who had been dead and was not dead anymore could just walk into Jerusalem and be like and so they want to kill him too. But the point that they were making here is that we can't let him go on like this. Verse 48, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. In other words, this has to happen now. The time pressure was substantial. And so when we start to ask those questions of why didn't they just follow the rules on not having a trial in the middle of the night, part of what the reason is because they felt like they could not wait a second more than they had to get this done. And so they were willing to sort of set aside that rule in order to try to get the result that they were looking for. Here's a second rule when it came to the trials, the timing of trials. And that was this. A trial that led to a conviction was not allowed to be completed in a single day. We're not allowed to have a one-day trial which led to a conviction. And I'll read straight again out of the Jewish law itself. And while in non-capital cases, any verdict could be entered on the same day as the trial. For capital cases, an acquittal, that is finding a person not guilty, that could happen in a single day. But for a capital case where a person is to be convicted, a verdict of conviction, quote, could not happen until the following day. Why do you think that rule would be in place? You can have the trial on day one, but if you're going to convict a person and convict them and lead to a death penalty, you can't reach that judgment until at least the next day. The sleep on it rule. The cooling down period rule, right? That we don't want this to be a hasty, emotional decision. You can take all the evidence in on the first day, but you got to take a break, sleep on it, and come back the next day to try to put a person to death for that particular crime. Did they follow that rule? No. right? So between the time when he was arrested and the time where it gets the death sentence, less than 12 hours, right? I guess technically it had gone from Thursday night into Friday morning, but nobody slept on it, right? There's none of the sort of provisions of that. And I'll tell you, we still have vestiges of this rule in American law today. Under South Carolina law, if someone comes to your door, knocks on your door, and tries to sell you like a vacuum cleaner or whatever people go door to door selling today, by law, you have 3 days to cancel that contract if you buy it. Right? It's a cooling off period. Someone takes you on a guest pass to Planet Fitness, and while you're there, they sell you a gym membership. By law, you have 3 days after you sign up for that to cancel that contract. It's just this concept of we want to give you some time after you decide to commit to something to realize, oh, I made a dumb choice, shouldn't have done that, and to cancel it without any sort of ramifications, because we're talking about serious business here. And that's what we have here as well. They had an opportunity to deliberate, and they chose instead to act really quite hastily, and it leads to sort of this problem. Here's a third rule that comes directly out of Jewish law. A trial could not be held on the day of or on the day before a Jewish festival, or on the day of or the day before the Sabbath day. And again, this is straight out of Jewish law. It says, quote, trials may not be held on the eve of a Sabbath or on the eve of a festival. Did they follow that rule? No, because a portion of the all of the Roman trial and a portion of the Jewish trial takes place on overnight from Thursday night to Friday morning, when, as we've talked about, the Sabbath day would have started on Friday night, so they're the day before the Sabbath. And as we all started the class by talking about, there was this festival coming up, right? And you've got the Passover that was coming, and so you've got within a day or so of all of these events, them undertaking this trial. You know, what's interesting, when Jesus is put on the cross, what is the instigating factor for them removing him from the cross? Let's see if we can see this. Go. That's exactly right. Turn over to Matthew chapter 27. It's not Matthew. Let me see if it's in Luke's account. This is what happens when I go off my script and try to bring another scripture. I lose it. Mark 15, let's see there. Mark 15, verse 42. This does give us a piece of the puzzle. So it was, quote, preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath. So this is the time Jesus has just passed away. And the man named Joseph of Arimathea is coming to collect his body. So we see that Friday was the, quote, preparation day. That is the day before the Sabbath. So that is certainly a confirmation that a portion of Jesus' trial, which remember had taken place just earlier that morning, took place on the day before the Sabbath and on the day before the Passover, that is again a festival of the Jews. And so they had violated Jewish law when they had decided to undertake Jesus' trial on that day. So why not just wait until Monday morning and try him after the festival was, or wait a week and try Jesus after the festival is over? Why not do that? Because they couldn't wait, right? They had to go as quickly as they could, and if that meant violating their own rules, it did. The verse I was looking for actually comes from John 19, so let's read that as we finish up here. John 19. And remember, the question we're asking here is, what was the instigation for Jesus being taken down from the cross? Because, you know, if we were to look back at history and how the Romans operated their crucifixions, they often left people hanging on those crosses for days. And they'd let the birds just, pick away at the bodies. if it's meant as part as a fulfillment of the punishment, well, also it's kind of a warning to the people, right? They would hang on the cross what this person had been convicted of, and then you would see their half-eaten body and says, well, I better not do whatever that guy did, right? But on this occasion, Jesus was actually taken down. The question is why. So John 19, at verse 30, Jesus says, this is finished, and with that he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Now, it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because it was the Sabbath preceding the festival. Because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies be taken down. So again, breaking the legs would prevent them from pushing their bodies up so that they could breathe, and it would cause them to die more quickly. That's the reason why they go to Pilate and ask for this. But what the Jews are really doing here is saying, okay, we have to get these bodies down because the Passover rules say we can't leave them. And I just want to end by noticing sort of the irony or the hypocrisy here, that on the day where they were willing to violate their rules on Passover and festivals to get Jesus arrested, tried, and killed in violation of those rules, they were at the same time saying, okay, well, we have to comply with those rules and get the bodies down before the Passover starts. If you were to sit one of them down and ask them to explain why it was okay for them to do this, but not okay for them to do that on that same day, how do you think they would explain the apparent hypocrisy of that? There is no good answer. And I just wonder, the larger question we often ask about this is, what did they think the law was? Is it something that we all have to follow all the time? What is it then? What is the law? What is the importance of having legal rules in place if you can pick the ones you want to follow and pick the ones you don't want to follow? I think in their minds it was a way of gaining, acquiring, and maintaining power. And that is, I think we have to understand, a lot of the ways in which a lot of people think of the concept of law. It's not necessarily rules everyone has to follow all the time, but it's a way for some people to gain power and other people to maintain power, and for the people without power to be stuck with the rules, while the people who have the power don't have to follow them. That's kind of a really dark place, bless you, to end. But we will end on that note, and we'll pick up next time we're together. Thank you, guys.